Friday afternoons had a way of slowing down time at Jefferson Middle School. The clock above the whiteboard in Principal Bradley Cole's office ticked louder than usual, each second a small rebellion against the promise of the weekend. Outside, the halls buzzed with the usual pre-dismissal chaos, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking on tile, teachers calling last-minute reminders to students who had already mentally checked out. Bradley sat behind his desk, fingers hovering over his phone screen. He glanced toward the office door, then down again. Was it stupid to order fast food at work? He could already hear his assistant, Ms. Lorman, reminding him of the wellness memo he'd emailed out last week: healthy choices, healthy minds. But honestly, he didn't care. He tapped the app. Double bacon cheeseburger, large fries, Diet Coke, like that somehow canceled it out. A few more taps and the order was placed. Estimated delivery time, 16 minutes. Just enough time to finish off the final parent email waiting in his inbox. Bradley rubbed his eyes and sighed. The school year had barely made it to October, and he already felt like he was treading water. The disciplinary reports were stacking up. The district had issued a new attendance policy that punished tardiness without offering any real solutions. And the cafeteria's vending machines had broken, again. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for just a moment, letting the quiet hum of the ceiling vent soothe his nerves. Then he heard it. A sound, soft, muffled. Like a hiccup. Or a cry. His eyes snapped open. He paused, waiting, not quite trusting his ears. And there it was again. A stifled sob. Not the wailing kind you hear from first graders who scrape their knees. This was different. It was quiet. Contained. A cry that didn't want to be heard, but couldn't stay hidden anymore. Bradley stood slowly, listening. The sound was coming from the hallway just outside his office, near the stairwell that led to the old gym wing. It was almost 3:15, most kids had already left for the day. The few who lingered usually hung around for after-school programs or detention. But this? This didn't sound like detention. He opened the door carefully, trying not to startle whoever it was. The hallway was mostly empty, light from the setting sun streaking through the high windows. The lockers cast long shadows. His footsteps echoed quietly as he followed the sound, around the corner, past the trophy case, and then down 3 steps into a little-used nook beside the stairwell. And there, sitting alone against the wall, knees pulled tight to his chest, was a boy. His hoodie was pulled low over his head, but Bradley recognized him. Elijah Walker. 7th grade. Bradley had seen his name pop up in the attendance reports. Elijah had already missed 8 days of school this semester. Quiet kid. Never caused trouble. But teachers said he barely spoke. Just did enough to get by. The kind of student who could disappear in plain sight. Elijah didn't look up. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie, trying to pretend he wasn't crying. Bradley hesitated. There was a protocol for this. He was supposed to alert the school counselor, maybe call in Ms. Lorman. But something about the way Elijah hunched into himself made that feel wrong. Too formal. Too far away. So instead, he crouched down slowly, a safe distance away. "Hey," Bradley said gently. "Everything okay?" Silence. Elijah's shoulders tensed. Bradley tried again. "You hurt? Did something happen?" Still nothing. The boy just stared at the ground, jaw clenched. Bradley exhaled through his nose. He wasn't great at this kind of thing, not like his wife, Julie, who used to teach 3rd grade and had a way of getting kids to open up with nothing but a smile and a sticker. No, Bradley was more of a spreadsheet and meeting guy now. Even when he taught history years ago, middle schoolers had never been his specialty. He glanced at his phone. The food order had just arrived. "You hungry?" he asked suddenly. That made Elijah look up. Just for a second. Enough for Bradley to see the redness in his eyes. The quiet defiance. And something else, hope. Maybe just curiosity. Got a double cheeseburger, Bradley said, as if it were a peace offering. Fries, too. No pressure. But I can't eat all this by myself. Another pause. Then, slowly, Elijah wiped his face again and nodded, barely. Bradley smiled softly. Cool. Come on. Let's go back to my office. You don't have to say anything. Just, keep me company. They walked in silence. Elijah didn't meet his eyes, but he followed. Back in the office, Bradley handed him the burger and fries, cracked open the Diet Coke for himself, and sat down across from the boy, careful not to push too hard. Elijah ate slowly at first, like he wasn't sure if it was a trick. Halfway through the burger, his posture softened just a little. Bradley watched. He didn't ask more questions. Didn't press for answers. Just sat with him. And for a moment, in that small, beige-walled office lit by the last orange streaks of afternoon sun, the world felt a little quieter. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Later that evening, after Elijah had gone and the office was quiet again, Bradley sat alone, the empty food wrappers on his desk a quiet reminder of something that felt different. He didn't know what Elijah had been crying about. He didn't know why the boy had been alone under the stairwell. But he knew one thing with sudden clarity: he couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. Elijah Walker knew how to stay invisible. In a school of nearly 1,000 students, he had mastered the art of not being noticed, slipping in late, head down, books clutched to his chest, sliding into his seat before the bell rang. He didn't raise his hand in class. Didn't eat lunch in the cafeteria. And when the other kids joked, shoved, or shouted in the hallways, Elijah kept to the edge of the noise like a shadow on the wall. He'd learned early, when people notice you, they hurt you. Or they leave. Elijah lived with his grandmother, Miss Loretta Walker, in a small two-bedroom apartment just off Carter Street. The place smelled like peppermint and old cooking oil. It was clean, but worn, like most things in their life. The couch sagged in the middle. The kitchen faucet leaked unless you twisted it just right. And the heater only worked if you gave it a solid kick and said a little prayer. He didn't complain. Never had. Because after everything, at least he still had her. His parents had died 5 years ago. It was a Wednesday night. Elijah remembered because they were supposed to go to the skating rink that Friday, and his dad had promised him extra tokens for the arcade. But the promise never came. A drunk driver ran a red light. A head-on collision. His mom died instantly. His dad made it to the hospital, but not through the night. Elijah, 7 years old, had stayed home with his grandmother that evening, working on a science project about volcanoes. He had fallen asleep with red construction paper stuck to his fingers. By morning, the world was different. Grief, people told him, came in stages. But for Elijah, it came in routines. He learned how to keep quiet during the funeral. How to say, thank you, when adults whispered, be strong for your grandmother. He learned how to sleep with the TV on so the silence wouldn't scream. He learned not to cry in public, not even when someone said something cruel. Especially not then. By the time he reached 6th grade, Elijah had built a wall around himself, stone by stone, silence by silence. At school, teachers called him shy or withdrawn. They praised his handwriting, marveled at how neat his notebook was, but never noticed when he stopped turning in essays halfway through the year. They didn't notice when his shoes started to split at the soles, or when his winter coat was clearly too small, the sleeves inching up his wrists. Only Ms. Green, his language arts teacher, ever asked him something real. You like stories, huh? She'd asked one day, tapping the corner of a book he kept hidden in his lap during free reading time. Elijah had only nodded. You ever write your own? Another nod. She didn't press him. Just smiled and said, let me know if you ever feel like sharing. Stories are meant to be heard. He never did show her his writing. But he always made sure to finish her assignments. Until he didn't. Lately, things had gotten worse at home. His grandmother's health was slipping. She'd started to forget things, small things, at first. Where she put her purse. Whether she'd taken her medicine. But then she forgot to pay the electric bill. Forgot to turn off the stove. Forgot Elijah's teacher's name. Elijah started staying home more often. Told the school he had stomach aches, headaches, anything he could say without getting questioned too hard. He couldn't leave her alone. She was all he had left. He knew he was falling behind, and part of him cared. But the louder part, the tired part, just couldn't bring itself to fight. That Friday, the day with the cheeseburger, Elijah had tried to keep it together. He'd made it through most of the day, even though his stomach had growled during second period. Even though Jamal and Quincy had whispered loud enough for him to hear, yo, that Walker kid smells like a gym sock. Even though he'd seen the pink notice in his backpack, final warning, risk of truancy violation. He didn't cry when Ms. Lorman made him sit out of the school assembly because of his absences. But when the last bell rang, and the crowds rushed the hallway, and he stood there completely invisible, that's when it hit him. A sudden, burning pressure in his chest. Like something cracked open and all the pain he'd shoved down for months rushed up at once. He didn't know where else to go, so he slipped into the stairwell. Sat on the cold tile floor. And let himself cry, just a little. Just enough to breathe. That's when Principal Cole found him. Elijah hadn't expected the man to stop. He figured he'd get a lecture, or worse, sent to detention. But the principal just sat there. Asked if he was okay. Then came the burger. And that, strangely, had broken through. He hadn't eaten all day. Not because there wasn't food at home, there were always canned things and instant noodles, but because he'd been too anxious to think about eating. Too wound up in everything else. And now here was this grown man, someone Elijah had seen maybe twice all year, handing him hot food and not asking for anything in return. No lectures. No pressure. Just quiet. It made something loosen inside him. That night, Elijah didn't tell his grandmother what had happened. She asked how school was, and he said, okay. She asked if he ate, and he said, yeah. Then he tucked her in early and stayed up at the kitchen table with his spiral notebook. He flipped to a clean page. Date, October 7th. Title, The Day I Didn't Disappear. He stared at the blank space for a long time before writing the first line. Sometimes, all it takes is someone noticing you when you're trying your hardest to disappear. He didn't know why he wrote it. Didn't even know if it meant anything. But it felt good to put it down on paper. Like proof that the day had happened. That the warmth from that burger, and the silence in that office, had been real. Elijah closed the notebook and held it against his chest. He wasn't sure what would come next. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. Monday came fast. The October air had a cold edge that crept under jackets and sleeves, especially early in the morning. Elijah stood at the corner of Carter and Monroe, hoodie pulled tight around his face as the school bus rattled up the street. The driver barely glanced at him when the doors hissed open. As always, Elijah climbed to the back and took the seat by the window. Head down. Bag on his lap. Headphones in, though there was no music playing. It was just easier to keep people out that way. But today felt different. Not better. Just different. His thoughts kept circling back to that moment in the principal's office. The burger. The silence. That strange sense of safety, even though no promises had been made and no words of comfort exchanged. Principal Cole hadn't treated him like a problem. He hadn't looked at Elijah like he was a statistic. He had just looked at him. And in a world where most adults only noticed you when you messed up, that meant something. At school, Elijah moved through the halls the way he always did, quiet, half invisible. But as he passed the administrative wing, he slowed his steps. Principal Cole's office door was open. Elijah peeked inside. The man sat at his desk, typing something furiously into his computer, brow furrowed. He hadn't seen Elijah yet. Elijah turned to walk away. "Hey, Elijah." He froze. Slowly, he turned back. Cole had looked up, smiling, not the fake kind, the real kind. The kind that said, "Yeah, I remember you. You're not just another face." "Morning," Cole said, standing. "How you doing?" Elijah shrugged. Cole nodded like he understood. "Did you, get enough to eat this weekend?" Another shrug. "I've got a granola bar somewhere if you didn't. Not gourmet, but it'll do in a pinch." A pause. Then, very quietly, "I'm okay." It was barely above a whisper, but it was more than he'd said last time. Cole seemed to take the answer for what it was, a small victory. He didn't press. Just walked over to the desk drawer, pulled out the granola bar anyway, and handed it over. "You can save it for later," he said, tapping the wrapper. "Emergency snack stash." Elijah took it wordlessly and slipped it into his hoodie pocket. Before he turned to leave, he looked up just once, catching Cole's eye. "Thanks." And then he was gone. The exchange lasted maybe 60 seconds. But it set off a quiet ripple. In first period, Elijah didn't slouch down in his seat like usual. He sat upright. In second, he even answered a question, just one, and barely audible, but Ms. Green nearly tripped over her own surprise. And at lunch, instead of hiding in the library, he lingered outside the cafeteria, debating whether to go in. He didn't. Not yet. But he stood there longer than he ever had. Meanwhile, in the staff lounge, the whispers had already begun. "You gave Elijah Walker a burger?" Ms. Lorman asked, eyes wide as she stirred cream into her coffee. "With school funds?" "No," Cole said calmly, flipping through a folder. "With my own money. It was just food. You know what kind of message that sends, right? The other kids." "I know exactly what message it sends," Cole interrupted. "It says that he matters." She stared at him like he'd grown a second head. He knew what she was thinking. This wasn't how Principal Cole operated. The man she worked for was known for being fair but distant, efficient but impersonal. He wasn't the hands-on type. And he certainly wasn't the hand-out burgers type. Something was changing. He felt it too. That afternoon, in the hallway between classes, Elijah reached into his locker when a familiar voice snickered behind him. Well. Look who's besties with the principal now. Jamal." Elijah didn't turn around. "I saw you, Walker. In his office. You crying again, or just trying to get out of detention?" Quincy, the boy next to Jamal, laughed. Elijah didn't say a word. Just closed his locker slowly, fingers clenched tight around the straps of his backpack. He started to walk away. Jamal stepped in front of him. "You think you special now? Think that burger makes you better than us?" Before he could answer, though he hadn't planned to, another voice cut in. "Leave him alone." All three boys turned. It was a girl from Elijah's science class, Maria something. Petite, glasses too big for her face, but she stood firm. "Seriously," she said. "You're not funny." Jamal scoffed, but didn't push it. He muttered something under his breath and walked off with Quincy. Maria gave Elijah a small nod, then disappeared down the hallway. Elijah stood frozen for a moment. No one had ever stepped in like that before. He didn't know what to do with it. Later that evening, Principal Cole sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, staring at Elijah's student record again. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy's eyes. The weight in them. The kind of sadness that didn't belong on a kid's face. Julie, his wife, leaned over his shoulder. "You're thinking about him again?" "Yeah." She sat down beside him, took his hand. "You okay?" "I don't know," Cole admitted. "I thought being a principal meant fixing systems. Making rules. But this kid doesn't need a system. He needs someone to actually give a damn." She smiled. "Then give a damn." He laughed dryly. "I did. I gave him a burger. And it felt like the most human thing I've done in months." Julie reached over, closed the laptop. "Then keep going. Start there." The next morning, Elijah found another granola bar waiting in his locker. Taped to it was a yellow post-it note. "One small step. You matter. See." He stared at it for a long time. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled. Just a little. But it was real. Principal Bradley Cole used to believe that rules fixed everything. He grew up in a small town in Indiana, where sidewalks were cracked, the air smelled faintly of motor oil, and the only escape was a good report card. His dad was a factory worker, hard knuckles, harder silences. His mom worked nights at the grocery store, and in between shifts, she prayed over her sons like it was the only armor she could give them. Bradley wasn't the smartest kid in his class, but he was the most careful. The most obedient. He learned early that if you followed the rules, adults left you alone. Teachers praised you. Coaches picked you. You didn't make waves, you made progress. He clung to that logic like a lifeline. When he was 10, his older brother, Jake, got into a fight at school. Broke another kid's nose. Got suspended for 2 weeks. Their dad didn't speak to Jake for a month, and when he finally did, it was with a belt. Bradley had watched all of it. He made himself a promise that day. Follow the rules. Stay out of trouble. Stay invisible, if you have to. Just don't be the problem. Years later, when he started teaching U.S. history at a high school in Chicago, that same belief guided him. His classroom ran like a ship, structured, clean, predictable. His students did well. He was liked. Maybe not loved, but respected. Then the promotion came, vice principal. Then principal. Different school. More meetings. More policies. Less teaching. But the rules? They still worked, on paper, at least. Until now. Bradley sat in his office on Wednesday morning, hands folded over a report titled At-Risk Student Watch List, Q1 Update. Elijah's name was third on the list. Beside it, 8 unexcused absences. No recent disciplinary incidents. Social/emotional withdrawal noted by multiple staff. Recommendation, counseling referral. Bradley stared at the words. It was such a cold summary of such a complicated boy. He closed the file and leaned back, rubbing his jaw. For years, he'd used data to make decisions. He trusted spreadsheets, charts, graphs. They gave him the illusion of control. Of understanding. But what graph could explain the look in Elijah's eyes under that stairwell? What chart accounted for grief, or hunger, or the way a kid learned to disappear? The knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Ms. Green, Elijah's language arts teacher. Got a minute? She asked, stepping inside with a folder tucked under her arm. Sure. Everything okay? She gave him a measured look. I've been meaning to talk to you about Elijah Walker. Bradley nodded slowly. Go on. I've had him 2 years now. He doesn't talk much, doesn't cause trouble, but he's smart. When he writes, it's like he's got the whole world inside him, but only lets out a sentence at a time. She handed him a sheet of paper. Bradley scanned it. Sometimes, all it takes is someone noticing you when you're trying your hardest to disappear. He recognized the line instantly. It was the note Elijah had written the day they shared lunch. He must have submitted it as a writing prompt. "He's opening up," Ms. Green said quietly. "But not because of anything I've done." "You started something." Bradley set the paper down. "I didn't do much. Just sat with him. Sometimes, that's everything." She turned to go but paused in the doorway. "Just, be careful," she added. "This system isn't built to bend. If you bend too far, it breaks." That afternoon, Bradley walked the halls longer than usual during passing periods. He wanted to see things, not from his usual vantage point in the office, but on the ground. Among the lockers. Among the noise. Where the walls whispered things Data couldn't hear. He noticed things differently now. How Jamal controlled the hallway like a spotlight followed him. How kids like Maria lingered behind, afraid to take up space. How students like Elijah weren't just quiet, they were disappearing right under the noses of teachers too overworked to notice. Bradley felt a weight in his chest. He had built a career by upholding policies that made schools run smoother. But what if smoother wasn't better? What if smoother just meant quieter suffering? That evening, he pulled out an old photo album. He hadn't looked through it in years. There, on the second page, was his 7th grade class photo. He squinted at the awkward boy in the third row, sandy blonde hair, 2 big ears, a button-up shirt too stiff for comfort. He remembered that year. Remembered how scared he was every single day. His brother had just run away from home. Their father had taken it out on everyone. Bradley had hidden in books, in test scores, in silence. He'd been a ghost too. But he'd had one teacher, Mr. Reed, who noticed. Who asked how he was doing and actually waited for an answer. Who stayed after school and talked about history like it mattered. Who told him he could be more than just a rule follower. Mr. Reed never gave him a cheeseburger. But he gave him something else, the sense that he mattered. Bradley stared at the photo for a long time, then slowly closed the book. The next day, he called Elijah into his office again. Not because he was in trouble. Just, to talk. Elijah looked nervous at first. But when Bradley offered him a juice box and a quiet space, the tension softened. "How's your grandma doing?" Bradley asked. Elijah looked surprised. Then shrugged. "She forgets stuff a lot. Must be tough." Another shrug. "I used to take care of my brother when my parents worked late," Bradley offered. "It's a lot for a kid." Elijah's voice was small, but honest. "Sometimes I feel like I'm the only adult in the house." Bradley nodded. "You're not alone, Elijah. Even if it feels like it." The boy looked down at the floor. "Most days, it does." They sat in silence after that. Not awkward, just still. Like two people slowly finding language in quiet places. That night, Bradley updated Elijah's file. Not with codes or numbers. But with a single sentence under notes. Student demonstrates quiet resilience. Recommend support plan centered around relationship, not discipline. It wasn't in the district's standard form. But for the first time in a long time, Bradley didn't care about the form. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the faculty lounge felt a little colder than usual. Bradley Cole stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, watching as his colleagues filed in one by one. The air buzzed with low chatter, coffee cups clinking, chairs scraping against the linoleum floor. A staff meeting, routine, administrative. Nothing more than a blip on the calendar. Or so Bradley had thought. But as the meeting drew closer, something in his gut twisted. He'd been sitting with this unease for the past few days. There were whispers, small comments from a teacher here, a counselor there, about how things were changing at Carter Monroe High. They didn't say it outright, but Bradley could hear the undertones. He was stepping out of line. He wasn't sure where it had started. Maybe it was the granola bar. Or maybe it was the fact that he'd sat with Elijah after school, just talking, just listening. Maybe it was that he'd begun to think that, sometimes, kids needed more than rules. They needed to be seen. As the last of the teachers settled into their seats, the room quieted. Bradley cleared his throat and pulled out his notes. His eyes flicked across the faces in front of him, some expectant, some distracted, but most waiting for him to open with the usual agenda. "All right, everyone," he began, forcing a smile. "Today, I wanted to go over a few things for the upcoming semester. First, a quick update on the at-risk student watch list." A few heads perked up, but most teachers seemed more interested in the coffee machine than the meeting. Bradley pushed forward. "Elijah Walker, the student we've discussed a few times, is showing signs of improvement. His attendance has been better, and his teachers report that he's more engaged in class." There was a sharp intake of breath from across the room. Ms. Lorman, the guidance counselor, was the first to speak. "Bradley, we've all been talking about Elijah. You know he's a high-risk student. His record speaks for itself. This isn't a kid who just needs a little encouragement, he needs structure, discipline. He's already fallen behind." A murmur spread across the room. Bradley held up a hand. "I'm aware of that. But I don't think the answer is more discipline. He's not just failing because of a lack of rules, he's failing because no one's taken the time to understand him. He's not a statistic. He's a human being." There was a pause. Then, the room rippled with murmurs of disbelief. "You're telling us to give him special treatment?" Ms. Lorman's voice was tight with skepticism. "We can't play favorites, Bradley. We have a system for a reason." "I'm not asking for special treatment," Bradley said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm asking for an approach that sees the whole student, not just the grades or the behavior records. Elijah's been through things none of us can imagine. I think it's time we try something different." A tense silence settled in the room. Bradley could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his colleagues' eyes on him. "Bradley," Mr. Albright, the head of the math department, spoke up. "I get that you want to be compassionate, but this isn't about feelings. It's about what's best for all our students. If we start ignoring the rules for one kid, where does it stop? Do we just let every student bend the rules based on their personal struggles?" Bradley met his gaze without flinching. "The system we've built doesn't work for everyone, Dave. We've created a cycle where kids like Elijah are left behind. He doesn't need to be punished for his struggles, he needs support." "But you're babysitting him," Ms. Green, Elijah's language arts teacher, said, her voice biting. "What happens when the other kids see that? They'll want the same treatment. We'll have chaos. We're teachers, not therapists." Bradley's hands tightened around his notepad. He could feel his patience beginning to fray. He had expected resistance, but not this. Not from people who claimed to care about kids. "I'm not babysitting him," he said quietly, trying to keep his tone measured. "I'm trying to help him." There was a beat of silence before Ms. Green replied, her words slow and deliberate. "You're not his friend, Bradley. You're his principal. You're supposed to be the authority." Bradley stared at her for a long moment. Her words stung, but there was a kernel of truth in them. He wasn't supposed to be Elijah's friend. He wasn't supposed to be anyone's friend. He was the one who made the hard decisions. The one who upheld the rules. But as he looked around the room, at the teachers who were all nodding along to Ms. Green's words, Bradley felt something shift deep inside him. He wasn't sure how to articulate it yet, but he knew the system they had built was failing. And Elijah wasn't the only student who was getting lost in it. The meeting went on for another 30 minutes, but the tension never fully eased. Bradley left feeling the weight of his colleagues' skepticism pressing down on him. He wasn't sure if they'd understand, or if they even wanted to. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't turn back now. Later that day, as Bradley walked to his car, he found himself thinking about the look on Elijah's face the other morning when he'd handed him the granola bar. It was the kind of look that made him wonder what it would take to tear down the walls around that kid's heart. The walls that had been built by years of neglect, of invisibility. And then, just as quickly, Bradley thought of his own walls, the ones he'd built around himself over the years. The rules, the structure, the need to keep everything in order. He'd always believed that the walls were necessary. That without them, everything would fall apart. But now, he wasn't so sure. That night, as Bradley sat at his kitchen table, looking over his notes from the staff meeting, he found his eyes lingering on one particular sentence. Student demonstrates quiet resilience. Recommend support plan centered around relationship, not discipline. He had written it for Elijah. But now, as he read it again, he realized it applied to him too. Maybe it was time for him to start tearing down some walls of his own. The phone call came just as Bradley was sitting down to dinner. He'd been on edge all day after the staff meeting, replaying the conversation in his head like a broken record. The voices of his colleagues still echoed in his mind, their objections, their doubts. He felt like he was walking a tightrope, one misstep, and he'd fall. The screen on his phone flashed with a name he hadn't seen in years, Brian Lee. He stared at it for a moment before answering, his voice cautious. Brian? Bradley, my man. Brian's voice was loud, cheerful, like it always had been. It's been too long. How the hell are you? Bradley leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't spoken to Brian in at least 5 years, not since their last dinner together after college. Brian had been one of his closest friends back in those days, back when they both had big dreams and not much else. They'd lost touch when Brian moved to the West Coast to pursue his own career, and life had pulled Bradley in a different direction. But hearing Brian's voice now was like being hit with a wave of nostalgia. I'm doing okay, Bradley said, forcing a smile. Busy with work. You know how it is. Ah, the grind. Brian chuckled. I hear you. Hey, I was thinking about you the other day. You still doing the principal thing? Yeah, Bradley said, leaning forward, feeling a twinge of unease. Still at Carter Monroe High. Things have been interesting. Interesting? Brian laughed again. That's an understatement, isn't it? You always were the calm, collected one. What's going on, man? You don't sound like yourself. Bradley hesitated. It wasn't like him to open up about work, especially when it came to the conflicts at school. But for some reason, talking to Brian felt easier than talking to anyone else. Maybe it was because Brian had known him before the job had taken over every part of his life. Before the walls. Brian, I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Bradley admitted, his voice low. I've been thinking about how I run this school. The rules, the structure, it's not working for all of our kids. It's especially not working for one of them, Elijah Walker. He's in a bad place. And I'm trying to help him, but the more I do, the more I feel like I'm just making things worse. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and then Brian spoke carefully. Brad, listen to me. You can't fix everything. You know that, right? Bradley frowned. What do you mean? I'm just trying to do my job. But it feels like I'm getting resistance from everywhere. The teachers, the administration. It's like they're all so focused on the rules that they don't see what's happening with these kids. Elijah needs more than just discipline, more than just a lecture. He needs someone to see him, to hear him. You're talking about a system that's been in place for decades, man, Brian said, his voice soft but firm. People don't like change. And they certainly don't like it when someone starts questioning the way things have always been done. You're fighting an uphill battle. Bradley sat back in his chair, staring at the empty plate in front of him. He could feel the weight of Brian's words pressing down on him, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he should keep going down this path. Maybe Brian was right. Maybe he was being naive. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Bradley said quietly. "I'm not sure I can keep fighting a system that doesn't care." There was a long pause before Brian responded, his tone serious now. "Bradley, I'm going to tell you something I wish someone had told me years ago." Bradley sat up, his attention peaked. "Being a leader isn't about having all the answers," Brian said, his voice steady. "It's not about having control, or even being liked. It's about knowing when to let go of the rules, and when to trust your instincts. You're not in charge of the system, you're in charge of the people within it. And if you don't trust your people, you're just going to burn out trying to follow every policy and procedure. You have to let them see you. You have to let them see that you're human." Bradley's mind raced. Let go of the rules. Trust his instincts. "Brian, I don't know if I can do that," he admitted. "It feels like I'm walking a fine line here. I can't just throw everything away." "No, you don't throw everything away. You adapt. But you've got to ask yourself, what's more important? The rules that keep things running smoothly, or the people who need someone to see them for who they are? Sometimes, you've got to make your own rules. You've got to lead with your heart." Bradley sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Brian's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He thought of Elijah, the kid who had spent so much of his life trying to disappear. The kid who, maybe, just needed someone to step outside of the box and see him for who he truly was. The kid who needed someone to trust him. "Thanks, Brian," Bradley said softly. "I needed to hear that. Anytime, man. Just don't lose yourself in all this. You've got more power than you think." Later that night, after the call ended, Bradley stood at his kitchen window, looking out into the darkened streets of the neighborhood. The lights of the city twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world outside his school, of the world he'd once believed in, before he got lost in the rules. Brian's advice echoed in his mind, lead with your heart. For the first time in a long time, Bradley allowed himself to feel something other than stress. The walls around him, the ones he'd built so carefully, so meticulously, suddenly seemed fragile. They were the walls of a man who had tried to control everything, to make everything fit into neat little boxes. But maybe it was time to let those walls come down. The next day, Bradley walked into school with a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't keep doing things the same way. The rules, the structure, they were important, yes. But the people, the students, the teachers, they were more important. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start making room for both. It was late in the afternoon when Bradley decided to take the plunge. He had been thinking about it for days, about how to approach Elijah, how to make sure he didn't come across as another authority figure trying to fix him. He had heard enough from his colleagues to know that his new approach wasn't universally accepted. But it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was Elijah. He had been avoiding Elijah, in a way. At least, avoiding a real conversation. But today was different. Today, Bradley wasn't just going to stand at the front of his office like a distant figure. He was going to listen, really listen. As he walked through the school halls, the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. The building felt empty, most students had gone home for the day, and the teachers were winding down their lessons. But Elijah was still here. He always stayed late, Bradley had noticed. Probably because he had nowhere else to go. Bradley knocked gently on the door to the boys' office space, a small, quiet room off to the side of the gym, where Elijah worked on his assignments when he wasn't in class. "Come in," came Elijah's voice, muffled but clear. Bradley pushed the door open slowly, taking in the sight of the boy hunched over a notebook, scribbling furiously, his headphones in place. Elijah didn't look up at first, but Bradley could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the quiet anger that always seemed to simmer beneath the surface. "I thought I'd come check on you," Bradley said gently, stepping inside. Elijah pulled his headphones down, but didn't immediately look up. He didn't offer a greeting either, just a short, curt nod. It was almost as if he expected Bradley to ask him to leave or demand something of him, like all the other adults had done in the past. "I'm fine," Elijah muttered, his voice flat. He glanced at his notes again, tapping his pencil against the page. "I don't need anything from you." Bradley sat down across from him, careful not to push. He didn't want to overwhelm Elijah. The boy had been through enough already, and Bradley knew better than to think he could solve everything with a few words. "I'm not here to give you anything," Bradley said quietly. "I'm here to listen. To hear what you have to say." Elijah stopped tapping his pencil and slowly lifted his eyes to meet Bradley's. There was something in those eyes, something guarded, but also tired. Bradley could see the weariness in him, the way the weight of the world seemed to press down on his young shoulders. "I don't have anything to say," Elijah replied, his voice cold. "I'm fine, really." Bradley watched him for a moment, studying the way he sat, his posture stiff and defensive. Elijah didn't trust him, that much was clear. He probably didn't trust anyone. But Bradley wasn't giving up that easily. "Okay," Bradley said, leaning forward slightly. "But I don't think you're fine. I think you're hurting. And that's okay. You don't have to do this on your own, Elijah." Elijah's gaze dropped to the table again, and for a long moment, the room was silent. Bradley could almost feel the storm brewing in the boy's chest. The anger, the frustration, the fear of being vulnerable, it was all there, just beneath the surface. Elijah was waiting for Bradley to say something else, something that would either push him away or, just maybe, let him know he was truly being seen. "You think I'm just gonna open up and tell you everything?" Elijah finally spoke, his voice thick with skepticism. "That's not how it works. I don't need your pity. I don't need a therapist, either." Bradley nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. He wasn't offended, though part of him wanted to be. He understood Elijah's anger, even if he didn't fully understand where it came from. But this wasn't about understanding Elijah's past in one conversation. It was about showing up. It was about letting the boy know that someone, one person, was willing to fight for him, even when he didn't think he deserved it. "I'm not here to pity you," Bradley said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here because I see you, Elijah. And you matter. You've been through things that most people can't even imagine. But that doesn't mean you're alone." Elijah's face softened for a moment, just a fraction. Bradley noticed it, just the slightest shift in his features. It was like the armor around him cracked, if only for a second. "I don't need your help," Elijah said again, but this time, there was less conviction in his voice. He wasn't entirely sure anymore. Bradley sat back, allowing the silence to linger. He wasn't going to rush this. Elijah needed time, space, and trust. But Bradley could tell, this was a breakthrough, even if it was a small one. "Okay," Bradley said quietly. "But if you ever do need help, I'll be here. And I don't just mean for school stuff. If you need someone to talk to, I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to try to fix you. I just want to listen. If that's what you want." Elijah stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Bradley couldn't tell if he believed him or not. But the truth was, Bradley wasn't asking for belief. He was asking for a chance to be the one person in Elijah's life who didn't just write him off as a problem to be solved. "I don't need your charity," Elijah muttered, but there was something different about the way he said it this time. There was an uncertainty in his voice, a hesitation that wasn't there before. Bradley nodded, understanding. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering respect." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with something else, an unspoken understanding that hadn't existed before. Elijah didn't say anything else, but Bradley didn't push him. He simply stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. "If you ever want to talk, Elijah, my door is always open," Bradley said as he made his way toward the door. "No pressure. Just, whenever you're ready." For the first time in their brief interactions, Elijah's eyes followed him as he reached for the door handle. "Yeah," Elijah said softly, his voice almost drowned by the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "Maybe." Bradley gave him one last nod, then stepped out of the room, closing the door quietly behind him. He wasn't sure what Elijah's next move would be, but for the first time in a long while, Bradley felt like he had made some real progress. He wasn't trying to be Elijah's savior. He wasn't trying to fix him. He was just offering him the one thing that Elijah had probably never had, a chance to be heard. And in that moment, Bradley realized that maybe that was all Elijah needed. The following days were filled with an unease Bradley couldn't shake. It was as though the atmosphere of the school had shifted overnight. The energy had become dense with tension, with whispers filling the hallways and a sense of expectation hanging in the air. Bradley had barely noticed at first, too absorbed in his attempts to connect with Elijah and his own reflections on leadership. But now, as he walked through the corridors, it was impossible to ignore. Teachers glanced at him differently, offering curt nods instead of their usual warm greetings. Some of them even avoided eye contact. It wasn't overt, but Bradley could feel it, a coldness that hadn't been there before. He wasn't sure if it was the unorthodox way he had handled Elijah's situation or if it was something else entirely, but the ripple effect was undeniable. By the end of the week, it was clear that word had spread. A few teachers, who were more outspoken than the others, had begun questioning his methods in the staff room. "Bradley, can I have a word?" Mrs. Thompson, one of the more senior teachers, asked him one morning, her voice low. She was a no-nonsense woman, well-respected but never one to mince words. The thick lenses of her glasses magnified the steely look in her eyes. Bradley nodded and followed her into the teacher's lounge, where a few others had gathered. He took a seat, noticing that the group was smaller than usual. The usual chatter was absent, replaced by a tight, almost uncomfortable silence. "I've been hearing some concerns from the staff," Mrs. Thompson began, folding her arms across her chest. "And frankly, I'm concerned myself. This whole, being there for Elijah, thing, well, I don't know if it's the right approach. The boy is a disruption. He's been nothing but trouble since he got here, and it's not helping that you're giving him all this attention. We need to maintain order, Bradley." Bradley blinked, taken aback by her bluntness. He had expected some pushback, but not like this. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm just trying to connect with him. He's struggling. And sometimes, students like Elijah need more than just discipline, they need to feel like they matter," Bradley said, choosing his words carefully. "I know it might not seem like the conventional approach, but I believe it's worth trying something different." "You mean coddling him?" Mr. Wallace, another teacher, interjected sharply. "The kid's clearly playing everyone. Giving him this special treatment isn't going to fix anything. It's sending the wrong message to the other kids." Bradley felt his pulse quicken. The last thing he wanted was to make Elijah's situation worse by creating more division. He could feel his frustration building, but he held himself in check. He had to find a way to make them understand. "I'm not coddling him," Bradley said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm trying to meet him where he is. Elijah doesn't have anyone to turn to at home, no one who sees him for who he is. So I'm doing my best to change that. But I need you all to trust me on this. If we don't try something new, how can we expect anything to change?" Mrs. Thompson's gaze softened slightly, though she still didn't seem fully convinced. "I'm just worried, Bradley. We've seen students like him before. And it never ends well. If we don't nip this in the bud, it'll be chaos." Bradley paused, feeling the weight of her words. He understood her concern, and he knew that Elijah's behavior hadn't been easy for anyone. But Bradley couldn't shake the feeling that if he didn't push back, if he didn't try to see Elijah for who he truly was, then the boy would just slip through the cracks like so many before him. "I hear what you're saying," Bradley said slowly, "and I'll keep an eye on things. But I still believe that this is the right course of action. I need you all to trust that we can make a difference." The room was quiet for a moment, and then Mrs. Thompson sighed, a sound of reluctant acceptance. "All right, Bradley. We'll see how this plays out. But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, she turned and walked out of the lounge, the others following behind her. Bradley remained seated, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. The challenge was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The next few days were filled with tension, both inside the classroom and outside. Bradley could feel the eyes of the staff on him, and he knew that whatever he did next would either prove his approach right, or disastrous. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. Not now, not when he had come this far. He had made a promise to Elijah, and to himself, that he would see this through. That Friday afternoon, Bradley decided to go to the gym. It was a routine he had gotten into recently, spending some quiet time in the gym, watching the students play basketball, listening to the laughter and the occasional shouts of joy that filled the air. It was a place that felt less rigid than the classrooms, less structured. And maybe, just maybe, it would help him clear his head. As he walked through the door, he saw Elijah shooting hoops by himself, the ball bouncing with a steady rhythm as he practiced his shots. Elijah's eyes were fixed on the hoop, his posture tense, but there was a focus in his movements that Bradley hadn't seen before. It was different from the usual defiance, the typical, "I don't care" attitude. There was something raw and real in his determination. Bradley leaned against the wall, watching for a moment before speaking. "You're getting better," he said, his voice casual but warm. Elijah didn't stop shooting, but his lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Yeah, well, it's the only thing I'm good at." Bradley raised an eyebrow. "I wouldn't say that. I think you're good at a lot of things." Elijah glanced over at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Like what?" Bradley walked closer, resting his hands on his hips. "Like standing up for yourself. Like surviving, despite everything that's been thrown your way." Elijah snorted, but there was no anger in it. "Yeah, surviving. That's about all I can do." Bradley nodded thoughtfully, his gaze turning to the basketball hoop. "Surviving's a lot, Elijah. But I think you're capable of more. You don't have to just survive. You can live. You can thrive." Elijah was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the ball as he dribbled it slowly. Then, he looked up at Bradley again, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what that even means," Elijah muttered, his voice quieter now. "I'm just trying to get through the day." Bradley smiled softly. "I know. But maybe getting through the day isn't the only thing that matters. Maybe we can figure out what comes after that." Elijah didn't say anything else. Instead, he picked up the ball again and made another shot, this one landing perfectly in the hoop. It wasn't a huge moment, but for Bradley, it felt like a small victory. As Bradley left the gym that day, a thought lingered in his mind: change wasn't going to be easy. And it certainly wasn't going to be quick. But he had made the first move. He had opened the door. Now, it was up to Elijah, and to himself, to walk through it. It was the kind of day when everything seemed to go wrong at once. The weather outside was overcast, a gray blanket that hung heavily over the school, and inside, the air felt thick with anticipation, like the whole building was holding its breath. Bradley could feel at the moment he stepped into the school that morning, something was off. The usual hum of students passing in the halls was replaced by whispers, quick, sharp glances exchanged between teachers, and then, finally, the unmistakable tension that clung to the walls. By mid-morning, it was clear why. Bradley had just finished his meeting with the district's head of operations when he received an urgent text from Mrs. Thompson, his head teacher and longtime colleague. Elijah Walker involved in a fight in the hallway. Need you to come immediately. Bradley's heart skipped a beat. Elijah. He had been doing better, hadn't he? The last conversation in the gym had felt like a breakthrough. But now, a fight? He quickly made his way down the hall, his thoughts racing. Was this the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that would test his resolve? Was this where the cracks in their connection began to show? As he turned the corner into the hallway, he spotted a small crowd of students gathered around, their whispers too loud to ignore. Mrs. Thompson stood at the center of the crowd, her arms folded and a stern expression on her face. But it wasn't just Elijah she was looking at, it was the other student involved. Elijah stood off to the side, his arms crossed tightly, a look of frustration etched across his face. His usual posture of defiance was there, but there was something more vulnerable about him today, something deeper. Bradley stepped forward, his eyes scanning the scene. The other boy, a student named Lucas, someone who had been known for picking fights, was standing with his back to Elijah, looking at the floor, his jaw clenched. Bradley, Mrs. Thompson greeted him with a tense nod. This is what I feared. Elijah here, she glanced at the boy, then back at Bradley, her tone disapproving. He's gotten into another fight. Bradley nodded, his mind racing. What happened? Lucas finally looked up, his face flushed with anger, though he seemed unsure of himself. He pushed me first, the boy blurted out, his voice shaky. I was just minding my business, and he shoved me. Bradley looked at Elijah, who stood silently, his gaze avoiding everyone. There was no typical outburst, no defensive snap. Just the same quiet tension that had been building between them over the last few weeks. Elijah, Bradley said gently, stepping toward him. What happened? The room grew still. Elijah didn't immediately answer. Instead, he glanced at Lucas, then at the ground, his jaw tightening as if he was holding something back. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. He's been calling me names for weeks now. You can ask anyone, Elijah said, his eyes briefly meeting Bradley's before he looked away. Today, I just couldn't take it anymore. I didn't push him first. I just had enough. Bradley watched him closely, his heart aching. Elijah wasn't making excuses, he wasn't trying to blame anyone. He was simply trying to explain, trying to justify an action that, in his mind, had been the only option left. The truth was, Elijah had been the subject of taunts for months, many students didn't understand him. Some avoided him altogether, while others, like Lucas, seemed determined to make his life miserable. The fight, Bradley could tell, wasn't just about today. It was the culmination of weeks of insults, small slights that added up until Elijah exploded. He had been holding his composure for so long, trying to be the bigger person, but there was a limit to how much a person could bear. Mrs. Thompson, what are the next steps? Bradley asked, his voice calm but firm. Do we need to separate them? Mrs. Thompson glanced between Bradley and the two students, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Elijah's behavior is unacceptable, and Lucas is injured. We need to involve the parents. I'll send them home for now, but you should know, if this continues, we might have to suspend Elijah. Bradley's stomach churned at the thought. He had seen the cracks in the system before, the ways in which students like Elijah got left behind, punished instead of helped. This wasn't the solution. He knew it wasn't. Elijah, listen to me, Bradley said, turning to face him directly. I know you're frustrated. I get that. But fighting isn't the answer. It never will be. We have to find another way to deal with this. Elijah looked up at him, his face hardening. And what do you suggest I do? Let people keep pushing me around? His voice cracked, the anger evident, but there was a tinge of hurt in it too. Bradley paused, choosing his next words carefully. No one should have to endure that kind of treatment. But I know there's a better way to handle it. I'm not going to tell you to ignore it. I'm not going to pretend that what you're going through is easy. But fighting back in this way, it's not helping you, Elijah. It's only going to make things worse. A few seconds of silence hung in the air, broken only by the low murmur of students who were still watching from a distance. Elijah's shoulders slumped a little, the fight leaving his stance. He stared at the floor, his face unreadable. "I'm not going to suspend you," Bradley continued, his voice unwavering. "But you're going to have to work through this with me. We'll figure out a way to handle this together. I'm not giving up on you, Elijah. I'm not." For the first time in a long while, Elijah met his eyes, and Bradley saw something flicker in them. It wasn't anger. It wasn't defiance. It was something else, something raw, something vulnerable. Hope. "You're not?" Elijah asked quietly, almost as if he couldn't believe it. "No," Bradley answered firmly. "I'm not." The next day, Bradley sat down with Elijah in his office. They were going to work through what had happened, step by step. It was time to have the conversation that Elijah had been avoiding, about finding healthier ways to handle his anger, about building resilience without losing who he was in the process. But more than that, it was about trust. Elijah needed to know that Bradley wasn't going to abandon him. That in this world full of uncertainty, there was one person who believed in him, one person who would never give up. And in that moment, as Bradley looked across the desk at Elijah, he realized that he wasn't just fighting for the boy's future. He was fighting for his own, fighting for the chance to make a real difference, to create a space where kids like Elijah could finally find their place. The day after the fight, the school was buzzing with a heightened sense of unease. Bradley felt it the moment he walked through the doors, the whispers, the pointed looks, the hushed voices trailing off whenever he entered a room. The fallout from Elijah's altercation was unavoidable, and now, Bradley was caught in the middle of it all. He had stood by Elijah, but he was beginning to realize that standing firm in his decision was going to come at a cost. As he walked down the hall toward his office, he caught sight of Principal Wallace standing near the entrance of the staff room. Wallace's tall frame and square jaw made him an imposing figure, and Bradley knew that the conversation they were about to have would be far from pleasant. The principal's expression was unreadable, but Bradley could sense the tension in the air as he approached. "Bradley," Wallace said, his voice cool but controlled. "Can I have a word?" Bradley nodded, already anticipating the conversation. "Of course, Principal Wallace." They stepped into the staff room, and Bradley could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him as they whispered to each other. He'd always prided himself on maintaining a professional relationship with the staff, but today, it felt like he was walking into a storm. "Sit down," Wallace instructed, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. Bradley sat, keeping his posture relaxed but alert. Wallace wasn't one for pleasantries, so he didn't waste time getting to the point. "I'm sure you're aware of the situation with Elijah Walker," Wallace began, his voice low. "And I've been getting feedback from a number of staff members. People are concerned, Bradley. They're concerned about the message this sends. You're making excuses for a student who has been nothing but trouble since day one." Bradley felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew this was coming. What he hadn't expected, however, was the depth of Wallace's disapproval. "I'm not making excuses for Elijah," Bradley said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm trying to understand him. He's been through things that most kids can't even imagine, and he needs someone to show him that there's a way out. If we don't step in, if we don't give him a chance, then who will?" Wallace leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "Bradley, I'm all for helping students. But you're putting the school in a difficult position. You're not just protecting Elijah, you're allowing his behavior to affect the entire student body. You're essentially saying it's okay for him to behave this way. And that's not what we stand for here." Bradley felt the weight of Wallace's words, but he refused to back down. It's not okay for Elijah to behave this way. But it's also not okay for him to be punished for simply trying to survive in a system that's failed him. He's been ignored, rejected, and abused by his peers. And we can't keep punishing him for the things that are out of his control. Wallace's eyes narrowed. I understand your point, Bradley. I do. But there has to be a line. If Elijah doesn't start taking responsibility for his actions, if he doesn't learn how to handle himself without resorting to violence, then he's going to be a problem, not just for the school, but for his future. And you're not helping him by coddling him. Bradley's chest tightened, but he held his ground. I'm not coddling him. I'm trying to give him the tools to succeed. This isn't about letting him off the hook. It's about understanding what's really going on inside of him, and working together to fix it. Wallace was silent for a moment, as if weighing Bradley's words. Then, he sighed, leaning back in his chair. I don't like this, Bradley, he said, his voice softer now. You're walking a fine line. And I can't support you if this continues. We can't have students getting into physical altercations without consequences. The parents are already up in arms, and we can't afford any more public issues. You need to rethink your approach. Bradley's heart pounded in his chest. He knew the principal was right about one thing: public perception mattered. And if the fight became a bigger issue, it could spiral into something much worse. But the thought of abandoning Elijah now, after everything they had gone through together, was not something Bradley could accept. I'm not backing down, Principal Wallace, Bradley said, his voice firm. I'm going to continue working with Elijah. I'll find a way to help him without letting this affect the rest of the school. But I'm not going to just punish him. Not when I know he needs something more. There was a long pause. Wallace studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he shook his head, a rueful smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I admire your dedication, Bradley. But you're going to have to make a choice. Either you follow the rules, or you deal with the consequences. I can't protect you if you keep going down this road. Bradley's resolve hardened. I understand. Wallace nodded curtly. Good. But don't expect me to support your decisions from here on out. Bradley stood up, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. He knew that he had just made an enemy of the principal, and that the road ahead was going to get even harder. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. Elijah needed him. As he left the staff room, Bradley's thoughts were a whirlwind. He had just committed himself to a course of action that could cost him his career. The tension between his desire to protect Elijah and the pressure to conform to the school's expectations was becoming unbearable. But no matter what, he wasn't going to give up on Elijah. He couldn't. Later that day, as Bradley sat at his desk reviewing his notes for the next day, Elijah came to find him. The boy knocked on the door, his face tense, his hands shoved in the pockets of his hoodie. Mr. Harris? Elijah said quietly, stepping inside. Bradley looked up, offering a small smile. Hey, Elijah. How are you doing? Elijah shrugged, his expression unreadable. You're still sticking by me, right? Bradley nodded, his heart tightening at the question. Of course. No matter what. Elijah hesitated for a moment, then his voice grew softer. I don't get it. Why are you doing this? You're gonna get in trouble for me. Bradley leaned forward, his gaze steady. I'm doing this because I believe in you, Elijah. I know things have been hard for you, but I'm not giving up on you. I'm not going to let you become just another statistic. You've got potential, and I'm going to help you realize it. Elijah didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes searching Bradley's face. Then, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Thanks. Bradley smiled. We're in this together. As Elijah left the office, Bradley felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, he knew that. But with Elijah's trust, and his own unwavering commitment, he felt ready to face whatever challenges came next. Because no matter how hard it got, Bradley had made a promise. And he wasn't going to break it. The school had become a pressure cooker, and Bradley was starting to feel the heat. As the days passed, Elijah's behavior was becoming more erratic. The boy who had once shown so much promise was now slipping further into the shadows. It wasn't just the fights, those had been happening with alarming frequency, but the way Elijah was starting to withdraw, to close off from everyone around him, including Bradley. Bradley had always known that helping Elijah wasn't going to be easy. But lately, the boy seemed to be pushing him away, and Bradley wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting this battle. The stress of his job was beginning to take its toll, and the increasing tension at school was only making things worse. With the administration growing more frustrated with him, and the other teachers looking at him with judgment, Bradley found himself standing at a crossroads. It was a Thursday afternoon when Bradley received an emergency call from Mrs. Thompson. She sounded more than a little rattled. "Bradley, you need to get here now. It's Elijah." Bradley's stomach dropped as he grabbed his coat and rushed out of his office. His mind raced with 1,000 possible scenarios, none of them good. He knew that Elijah had been struggling, but the fact that Mrs. Thompson was calling him of all people meant that things had gone from bad to worse. When Bradley arrived at the scene, he found the hallway filled with students. Their murmurs hushed the moment he walked through the door, and he saw Mrs. Thompson standing by the door of the boys' bathroom, her face pale and drawn. "Bradley," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "He's in there." Bradley's heart sank. Without another word, he walked past her and into the bathroom. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as he stepped inside, his eyes immediately landing on Elijah. The boy was sitting against the wall, his head bent low. He was crying, quiet, almost imperceptible sobs, but there was no mistaking it. Elijah had never shown this kind of vulnerability before. He was always the tough kid, the one who kept everyone at arm's length, never letting anyone see him break. And yet, here he was, crumpled in a corner, his emotions spilling out in front of Bradley. "Hey, Elijah," Bradley said gently, kneeling down in front of him. His voice was soft, calm, trying not to startle the boy. "Talk to me. What's going on?" Elijah didn't respond right away. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face streaked with tears. He shook his head slowly, refusing to meet Bradley's gaze. "Please, Elijah," Bradley pressed, his voice tinged with concern. "I'm here for you. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." There was a long pause before Elijah finally looked up, his eyes filled with pain and exhaustion. His voice was hoarse when he spoke, barely above a whisper. "I can't take it anymore," Elijah said, his words breaking through the silence like a cracked dam. "Everyone's on me. The kids, the teachers. It's like nobody sees me. I try to keep it together, but I can't. I don't belong here. I don't belong anywhere." Bradley's heart ached as he listened to Elijah's confession. He had always known that Elijah had deep emotional wounds, but hearing the raw pain in his voice brought it all to the surface. This wasn't just about the fights anymore. This was about something much deeper, something Bradley had only begun to scratch the surface of. "Don't say that," Bradley said firmly, reaching out and placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You do belong here. You're not alone. I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together, okay? We'll figure this out, one step at a time." Elijah shook his head, his tears falling faster now. "No, you don't get it. I'm a lost cause. I've messed up too many times. I don't know how to fix it." Bradley felt a wave of compassion wash over him, but he knew he had to tread carefully. Elijah's self-doubt was like quicksand, and the more he struggled, the deeper he would sink. Bradley couldn't let him go down that path, not when he had the chance to help him. "You're not a lost cause," Bradley said, his voice steady. "You've made mistakes, but that doesn't mean you're beyond help. I'm here because I believe in you, Elijah. I'm not going to give up on you." Elijah's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for a moment, Bradley thought he might break down completely. But then something changed. Elijah looked up at Bradley, his expression softening ever so slightly. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible. Bradley stood up, offering his hand to Elijah. "You don't have to do this alone. Let me help you. But we have to work together. I can't fix everything for you, but I can be here with you, every step of the way." Elijah hesitated, his gaze shifting between Bradley's outstretched hand and the ground. The battle inside him was evident, the push and pull between hope and despair. But after a long moment, Elijah reached out, his fingers brushing against Bradley's hand before he finally grasped it. Bradley pulled him to his feet gently, his heart swelling with relief. Elijah might not have been completely convinced, but in that moment, he had taken a crucial step, a step toward healing. "Thank you," Elijah said, his voice still raw, but with a faint trace of gratitude. "I didn't know who else to turn to." Bradley gave him a reassuring smile. "I'm always here for you, Elijah. Don't ever forget that." Later that afternoon, after Elijah had been sent home to rest and recover, Bradley sat in his office, reflecting on what had happened. It was clear that Elijah was at a breaking point. The weight of the world seemed to be pressing down on him, and Bradley knew that this wasn't just about school anymore. This was about the deep emotional scars Elijah had been carrying for so long. Bradley had been walking a fine line ever since he decided to protect Elijah, but today, he realized that the stakes were even higher than he had imagined. This wasn't just about Elijah's future, it was about the future of all the kids like him, the ones who slipped through the cracks because the world didn't know how to handle their pain. And as Bradley sat there, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next, one thing became crystal clear: he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. And if he was going to save Elijah, and all the other kids like him, he was going to have to fight even harder than before. But no matter what, he wasn't going to give up. He had made a promise to Elijah, and he intended to keep it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The following day, Bradley's phone buzzed on his desk as he prepared for his next class. It was an email from Elijah's mother. His heart skipped a beat as he read the subject line, "Urgent, need to talk about Elijah." He clicked the email open, his eyes scanning the short but clear message. "Mr. Harris, I would like to speak with you about Elijah's recent behavior and what's happening at school. Please let me know when you're available. I'm very concerned about him. Mrs. Walker." Bradley knew this day was coming. The growing tension at school, Elijah's emotional breakdown, and the mounting pressure from Principal Wallace were finally going to catch up with him. Elijah's mother had been involved before, but this email felt different, more urgent, more desperate. He quickly replied, arranging a time to meet after school. His mind raced with possible scenarios. Elijah's mother, Mrs. Walker, had always been distant at school events, never too involved, but the few times they had spoken, he had sensed a deep, quiet concern in her eyes. Now, it seemed that concern had reached a breaking point. When Bradley arrived at the small, quiet cafe where he and Mrs. Walker had agreed to meet, he saw her sitting by the window, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She looked older than her years, her face lined with the weight of a lifetime of struggle. The moment she saw Bradley approach, she gave him a tight smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Harris, thank you for meeting with me," she said softly, gesturing for him to sit down. Bradley nodded and sat across from her, taking in her worn expression. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. "Of course, Mrs. Walker," Bradley replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "How are you?" She sighed heavily, looking out the window before turning her gaze back to him. "I'm worried, Mr. Harris. Elijah, he's not the same. I've noticed a change in him. He's been withdrawing more and more lately, and I don't know how to help him. I thought that maybe, just maybe, you could tell me what's going on at school." Bradley took a deep breath. He had been bracing for this conversation, but hearing her voice crack with concern still hit him hard. He knew the weight of what he was about to say. "Mrs. Walker, I've been working closely with Elijah," Bradley began, his tone measured. "He's struggling. There's a lot more going on than just the behavior we see on the surface. Elijah, he's been through a lot. A lot that I think he hasn't shared with you." Mrs. Walker's eyes flickered with something: pain, disbelief, maybe even guilt. She leaned forward, her voice steady but filled with worry. "What do you mean? I know my son has had it rough, but I've tried to be there for him. I've tried to give him everything I can. Why is this happening?" Bradley hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain the complexity of what he had been seeing in Elijah. Elijah has a lot of emotional scars. It's not just the fights at school or his trouble with his peers. There's more underneath all of that. I think he's been carrying a lot of pain for a long time, and it's affecting everything he does. Mrs. Walker's eyes hardened slightly, but Bradley could see the pain beneath her protective exterior. She was trying to hold it together, but it was clear that her worry was growing by the second. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered. "I've tried everything, taking him to therapy, keeping him in sports, keeping him busy, but nothing seems to work. It's like he's giving up. And I don't know how to reach him." Bradley's heart ached for her. He knew that, like most parents, Mrs. Walker was doing the best she could, but it wasn't enough. She couldn't fix everything. And neither could he, for that matter. "Mrs. Walker, you're doing the best you can," Bradley said gently. "But sometimes, it takes more than just the right activities or distractions. Elijah needs to feel seen. He needs someone who understands the depth of what he's been through. And right now, I think he's afraid to trust anyone with that." Mrs. Walker was silent for a moment, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Then, her voice cracked slightly as she spoke again. "He doesn't talk to me anymore. I don't know who to turn to. I don't know if I'm even doing the right things anymore." Bradley's gaze softened. He knew this was the crux of the issue. Mrs. Walker loved her son deeply, but sometimes, love wasn't enough. There were walls between them now, walls that Elijah had built in an effort to protect himself. "I think," Bradley began carefully, "Elijah's afraid to open up. He's afraid of disappointing you, or of being rejected. He's been hurt so much that he doesn't know how to trust anyone anymore, even the people who love him the most. But that doesn't mean he doesn't need you. He does. More than anything." Tears welled in Mrs. Walker's eyes as she let out a shaky breath. "I just want him to be happy. I want to fix this." Bradley reached across the table and placed his hand gently on hers. "You can't fix everything. But you can be there. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is just listen. Be patient with him. Let him know you're not giving up on him, no matter what. He needs that, more than you realize." Mrs. Walker nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this." Bradley squeezed her hand. "You are. You don't have to do it alone, though. You've got me, and you've got others who care about Elijah. We'll help him, but it's going to take time. It's going to take trust. But we'll do it together." There was a long silence between them as Mrs. Walker processed his words. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with a new kind of resolve. "I'll try. I'll do whatever it takes. I won't give up on him." Bradley gave her a small, reassuring smile. "That's all he needs. To know that you're there, no matter what." As Bradley left the cafe and walked back to his car, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was a start. Mrs. Walker was willing to do what it took to rebuild the relationship with her son. Now, it was up to Bradley to continue supporting Elijah through this difficult time. Elijah had a long road ahead of him, and so did his family. But Bradley was more determined than ever to make sure Elijah didn't have to walk that road alone. Bradley sat at his desk, the papers in front of him a blur of unread emails, discipline reports, and incident notes. He hadn't slept well the night before, his mind spinning with the conversations he'd had with Mrs. Walker, the burden of trying to help Elijah, and the increasing pressure from the school administration. His stomach churned with the weight of it all. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his train of thought. It was a call from Principal Wallace. "Bradley," Wallace's voice crackled through the receiver, "we need to talk. Can you come to my office immediately?" Bradley sighed, rubbing his forehead as he picked up the phone. "Of course, I'll be there in a minute." The walk to Principal Wallace's office felt like a slow march to the gallows. He had known that the situation with Elijah was about to get more complicated, but he hadn't expected the school's reaction to be this intense. The recent string of incidents involving Elijah had caught the attention of the higher-ups, and Bradley could already feel the noose tightening around his neck. When he entered Wallace's office, the principal didn't greet him with his usual stern but cordial smile. Instead, Wallace was sitting behind his desk, his fingers tapping impatiently on the wooden surface. "Have a seat," Wallace said, motioning toward the chair across from him. Bradley sat down, his palms sweating as he prepared himself for whatever was coming next. "I've been getting complaints, Bradley," Wallace began without preamble. "About Elijah. About his behavior. And frankly, about you. The administration is concerned." Bradley's heart sank. He had been expecting this, but hearing the words out loud still hit him like a punch to the gut. "What kind of complaints?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the rush of emotions flooding him. Wallace leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "There are rumors swirling that you've been giving Elijah preferential treatment. That you're coddling him. I've spoken with several teachers, and they're worried that you're ignoring school policies in favor of helping him. You're compromising the integrity of the school, Bradley." Bradley's throat tightened. This wasn't just about Elijah anymore. This was about his career. "I'm not coddling him, sir. I'm trying to help him. Elijah is dealing with more than just behavioral problems, there's a lot more going on under the surface. I've been working with his mother, and we're trying to address the root of the issue." Wallace shook his head, a look of disbelief on his face. "This is a school, not a therapy center, Bradley. We're here to educate, not to play counselor. Your job is to make sure he follows the rules, just like everyone else. You're crossing a line here." Bradley's frustration boiled over, but he kept his composure. "You don't understand. If we don't help Elijah now, if we don't give him the support he needs, he could fall through the cracks. And I won't let that happen on my watch." Wallace's gaze hardened, and for a moment, Bradley thought the conversation might be over. But then Wallace leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "I understand your concern, Bradley. I do. But you're walking a dangerous line. If you continue down this path, you're going to put both yourself and the school at risk. We can't afford to be seen as enabling students who refuse to follow the rules. This has to stop." Bradley's pulse quickened. "Are you asking me to stop helping him?" "I'm asking you to stop undermining school policy. I'm asking you to get back in line," Wallace replied coldly. "If you can't do that, then we'll have to reevaluate your position here. You're a good teacher, Bradley. But you need to stay focused on the job, not get personally involved with every student who's struggling." Bradley felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. He had given everything for this job, every ounce of energy, every hour he could spare, and now, it seemed like all of that was about to be taken away. "I'm doing what's right for Elijah," Bradley said firmly. "And I'm not going to stop." Wallace's face hardened. "Then I suggest you start thinking about your future here, Bradley. Because if you continue this, there will be consequences. I won't protect you from them." Bradley stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm sorry, sir. But I can't just stand by and watch a kid like Elijah fall apart because of rules that don't take his well-being into account." With that, Bradley turned and walked out of Wallace's office, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him like a suffocating cloud. The hallway felt colder now, and the walls seemed to close in as he made his way back to his own office. Every step he took felt like a step further into a battle he wasn't sure he could win. By the time Bradley sat back at his desk, his hands were trembling. He stared at the screen in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to Elijah, how much he'd already gone through, how much more he had yet to face. And now, it seemed like the forces working against him were growing stronger. Bradley didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear, he couldn't back down now. Elijah needed him, and no matter what Principal Wallace or anyone else said, Bradley wasn't going to abandon the kid who had trusted him. His phone buzzed again. It was a text from Mrs. Walker. "Mr. Harris, I just spoke with Elijah. He's upset, and he wants to talk to you. Is there any way you could meet him after school?" Bradley's stomach twisted, a sense of urgency rising in him. Elijah was struggling more than ever, and now with the pressure from the school mounting, Bradley knew he had to find a way to support him, no matter what. He replied quickly, "I'll be there, Mrs. Walker. I won't let him down." That afternoon, as the final bell rang, Bradley made his way to the address Mrs. Walker had given him. The small house was modest, tucked in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. As he approached the front door, he could hear voices inside, Mrs. Walker's low murmur, Elijah's sharper tone. He knocked, and the door opened to reveal Mrs. Walker, her face lined with exhaustion. "He's in his room," she said softly. "He hasn't been himself lately. I think he needs you." Bradley nodded, stepping inside. He walked down the hallway toward Elijah's room, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just another student, this was a boy who had lost his way, and Bradley was the only one who seemed to be reaching out. When he knocked on Elijah's door, there was no answer at first. He knocked again, a little louder. "Elijah," Bradley called gently. "It's Mr. Harris. Can I come in?" The door creaked open just slightly, and Elijah's tired eyes met his. "I don't know what to do," Elijah muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything's falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it." Bradley stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You don't have to fix everything right now, Elijah. We'll take it one step at a time, okay? But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." As Bradley sat down beside him, Elijah slowly began to open up, and for the first time in a long while, Bradley felt like he might actually be able to help. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Bradley sat on the edge of Elijah's bed, watching the boy stare out the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. For a moment, Bradley felt like an intruder in this small, dimly lit room, unsure of how to proceed. "Elijah," Bradley said softly, breaking the silence. "You don't have to say anything right now, but I'm here. You don't have to go through this alone." Elijah didn't respond immediately, but Bradley could see the tightness in his posture, the way his jaw clenched as though he was fighting to keep the tears at bay. After what felt like an eternity, Elijah finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to fix it," he said, his eyes still fixed on the distant view outside. "Everything's falling apart, Mr. Harris. I keep screwing up. I don't even know who I am anymore." Bradley's heart tightened in his chest. This wasn't the defiant, angry Elijah he had seen earlier in the year. This was a broken boy, a boy who felt like he had no way out. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Bradley said gently, his voice filled with warmth. "What matters is that you're not alone. You don't have to carry this on your own." Elijah shook his head, his shoulders trembling. "You don't understand. You don't know what it's like. All the stuff I've been through. It's not just school. It's everything. I don't think I can keep pretending anymore. I'm so tired of pretending." Bradley took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. Elijah's vulnerability hit him harder than he expected. He had seen students struggle before, but this was different. Elijah wasn't just acting out because he was angry or misunderstood, he was at the breaking point. And Bradley knew he had to be careful, had to tread lightly, or risk pushing him away completely. "I know it's hard, Elijah," Bradley said quietly. "I can't pretend to understand exactly what you're going through. But I want you to know that you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to pretend for anyone. Not for me. Not for your mom. You're allowed to feel whatever you're feeling. And it's okay to ask for help when you need it." Elijah's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for a moment, Bradley thought he might pull away again, retreat into that hard shell he had built around himself. But instead, Elijah slowly turned his head to meet Bradley's gaze. The raw pain in his eyes sent a sharp pang through Bradley's chest. "I don't know how to ask for help," Elijah whispered. "I don't even know what I need. It just feels like everything's too much. And when I try to talk about it, people just don't get it. They just want to fix me. But I don't think I can be fixed. Not anymore." Bradley felt a lump form in his throat. He had never heard Elijah speak this way, so defeated, so utterly broken. He knew this moment was a turning point. This was the moment when Elijah needed someone to step in and make sure he didn't spiral further. And it had to be him. "Elijah," Bradley said firmly, "you don't need to be fixed. You need to be heard. And I'm here to listen. You don't have to have all the answers, but I'll be here every step of the way while you figure it out. No one's asking you to do this alone. You've got people who care about you. I care about you. And we'll work through this together." For the first time that evening, Elijah's expression softened. His walls didn't crumble completely, but Bradley saw a glimmer of something, hope, maybe. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "I don't know if I can believe that," Elijah said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." Bradley leaned forward, keeping his tone calm and steady. "Trust is hard, I know. And it takes time. But I promise you, Elijah, you're not alone in this. I won't let you fall through the cracks. You're worth fighting for." Elijah looked down at his hands, his fingers nervously picking at the fabric of his pants. He seemed lost in thought for a moment, as if processing Bradley's words. Then, almost as if a dam had broken, he let out a long breath and slumped back against the pillows. "I just don't know how to stop it," he muttered. "I don't know how to stop the pain. Every day it's like I'm drowning, and no matter how hard I try, I can't get out of it." Bradley's heart clenched. He had seen students struggle with depression, with anxiety, but Elijah's words felt like a punch to the gut. This was more than just a rough patch or a difficult period in a teenager's life. This was a cry for help, and Bradley knew that if he didn't act now, things might take a turn for the worse. "Elijah," Bradley said softly, his voice full of conviction, "it's okay to not have everything figured out. You're not weak for feeling the way you do. You don't have to carry it all by yourself. We can find a way to help you through this, but you have to trust me enough to take the first step." Elijah's eyes met his again, and for a brief moment, Bradley saw the boy he had once known, the one who had walked into his classroom full of potential, even if it had been buried under layers of pain and mistrust. That Elijah was still in there, somewhere. I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore," Elijah whispered again, the words coming out with a rawness that tore at Bradley's heart. "But I'll try. For you. For my mom. But I don't know how." Bradley nodded, a mixture of pride and relief washing over him. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. And sometimes, that was all it took to start the healing process. "We'll take it one day at a time, okay?" Bradley said gently. "You don't have to have all the answers. I'll be here, and we'll get through it together." Elijah nodded, his gaze softening as he leaned back against the pillows, exhaustion taking over. The conversation had drained him, but Bradley could see the faintest flicker of hope in his eyes, something that hadn't been there just hours ago. As Bradley left Elijah's room later that evening, he felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over him. Elijah had taken the first step toward opening up, but there was so much more work to be done. Bradley knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that Elijah had the strength to make it through. The hardest part was over, the breaking point had come, and Elijah hadn't given up. And neither would Bradley. As he walked out of the house and back to his car, Bradley's thoughts were filled with a new determination. He wasn't about to let Elijah slip through his fingers, not when he had the chance to make a difference. The next few days were a blur of meetings, paperwork, and endless phone calls. But through it all, one thing remained constant: Bradley's commitment to helping Elijah. The weight of the conversation they'd had that night still hung heavily in his mind. Elijah had opened up in a way that Bradley hadn't anticipated, and though it was painful to witness, it had also been a breakthrough. The boy had agreed to try, just try, to trust him, and that meant everything. Still, Bradley couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was walking on a tightrope. Every move he made seemed to have a ripple effect, and it wasn't just Elijah's life that was on the line. His own career, his reputation, his very place at the school, it all felt precarious. But Bradley knew one thing: Elijah needed him. And no matter the cost, he wasn't going to back down. The following Monday morning, Bradley found himself in his office early, trying to get a head start on the day. He glanced at his calendar: another set of meetings with the school administration, more progress reports to write, more parents to talk to. As much as he wished things could be simple, they were anything but. A knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Mrs. Walker standing in the doorway, her expression serious. "Mr. Harris, I think you need to see this," she said quietly, stepping inside and handing him a piece of paper. Bradley took the paper and scanned it quickly. His stomach sank. It was a disciplinary notice regarding Elijah. He had been involved in another altercation at school, a fight, this time with a group of boys who had been bullying him for weeks. The report mentioned that Elijah had lost control and had been verbally aggressive during the confrontation. The severity of the situation was enough to warrant a meeting with the administration. Bradley felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had known Elijah was struggling, but this was something else entirely. He'd promised Elijah he wouldn't let him fall through the cracks, but now, with this report in front of him, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. "I'll talk to him," Bradley said, his voice tight. "Thank you for bringing this to me." Mrs. Walker nodded, but Bradley could see the concern in her eyes. "You know he's been through a lot, right? But this is different. I think it's starting to catch up with him. You need to be careful, Bradley. Elijah's not the only one affected by all this." Bradley swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. "I know. But I'm not going to give up on him." After Mrs. Walker left, Bradley sat at his desk, staring at the disciplinary notice. Elijah had fought back. That wasn't like him. He'd always been a quiet kid, someone who kept his head down. But now, the pressure was building, and Bradley could see it in every action Elijah took. The bell rang for the start of the day, and Bradley stood up, grabbing his jacket and heading toward the classroom. His mind was racing, but he knew he had to stay focused. Elijah needed him, and if he was going to help, he had to be there. At lunch, Bradley found Elijah sitting alone in the cafeteria. The boy's eyes were downcast, his tray of food untouched. There was a weight in the air that Bradley couldn't ignore. It was the same look Elijah had worn when they'd first started working together, withdrawn, defeated. Bradley approached cautiously, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. Elijah didn't look up, but Bradley wasn't deterred. "You're not eating," Bradley remarked, trying to keep his tone light. "Didn't they make your favorite today?" Elijah didn't respond at first, and for a moment, Bradley wondered if he would. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Elijah spoke. "I don't care about food," he muttered. "I just don't care about anything." Bradley's heart tightened. This wasn't the Elijah he knew, the one who had shown the first spark of hope just a few days ago. Something had changed again. Something had made him retreat into that dark place. "I saw the disciplinary report," Bradley said gently. "I know what happened, Elijah." Elijah's shoulders tensed, and he finally lifted his gaze to meet Bradley's. His eyes were filled with a mixture of shame and anger. "I didn't want to fight," Elijah said, his voice raw. "But they wouldn't leave me alone. They kept calling me names, and I snapped. I couldn't take it anymore." Bradley nodded slowly, understanding. He knew all too well what it felt like to be pushed past your breaking point. But he also knew that this couldn't be the answer: violence, retaliation. Elijah needed a way out, a better way to cope. "Elijah, I know you're angry," Bradley said quietly. "And I know that what those boys did to you isn't fair. But fighting back, it's not going to solve anything. It's just going to get you into more trouble. And I don't want that for you." Elijah's jaw clenched. "You don't get it, Mr. Harris. No one gets it. They don't see what it's like. They don't know what it feels like to be pushed around every single day. I had to do something." Bradley sighed, leaning forward. "I do get it. I've seen kids go through what you're going through. I've seen the way they struggle with the same things. And I can't promise you that things will magically get better overnight. But I can promise you that I'll help you find a better way to handle it. We can get through this, Elijah. I'm not going to give up on you." Elijah stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing Bradley's words. Then, to Bradley's surprise, he finally nodded. I don't know if I believe you," Elijah said quietly, his voice barely audible. "But I'll try." Bradley's heart gave a small leap of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. A glimmer. The following days were difficult, to say the least. Bradley met with the school administration to discuss Elijah's latest incident, trying to plead his case that Elijah needed more support, not punishment. But the administrators were cold and dismissive, only concerned with keeping the school's reputation intact. Bradley knew the odds were stacked against him, but he refused to give up. He spent more time with Elijah, offering guidance when he could, listening when it was needed. And little by little, Elijah seemed to open up again, though it was clear he was still carrying the weight of his past. One afternoon, as Bradley was leaving school, he got a text from Mrs. Walker. "Mr. Harris, Elijah has made some progress. I think it's time for him to talk to a counselor. It could be a turning point for him." Bradley smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. Maybe, just maybe, they were getting somewhere. The days following Elijah's incident were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and moments of uncertainty. Bradley found himself stuck between two worlds, the world he had built for himself as a teacher and mentor, and the one he had stumbled into as Elijah's protector. The weight of both responsibilities pressed down on him, and it was beginning to feel like the walls were closing in. That afternoon, Bradley stood outside the school building, watching as Elijah walked toward the bus stop. It was one of those rare moments when the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm golden light over the school grounds. But for Bradley, the warmth didn't reach him. He was stuck in a deep pit of indecision. Elijah had made progress in the last few weeks, small steps, but steps nonetheless. He had agreed to see a counselor, a breakthrough Bradley hadn't expected. But that wasn't enough. Not when he saw how weighed down Elijah still was. Not when he saw the way Elijah tried to hide his pain behind defiant walls, only to crack when no one was watching. Bradley's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and glanced at the message. It was from Mrs. Walker. "We need to talk. It's about Elijah." Bradley's heart skipped a beat. What was going on? What was he missing? He quickly typed a reply. "I'll be in my office in 10 minutes. Let's talk then." 10 minutes later, Bradley entered the school building and made his way to his office. Mrs. Walker was already there, pacing back and forth with a look of concern etched on her face. She stopped when she saw Bradley and motioned for him to sit. "I don't think Elijah's going to make it much longer here," she said, her voice laced with anxiety. "The administration is already discussing suspension, maybe even expulsion. The last thing they want is for a situation like his to escalate." Bradley's stomach churned at the thought. Expulsion? Elijah? He couldn't let that happen. Not after everything he had been through. "What do you mean?" Bradley asked, his voice steady despite the growing panic in his chest. Mrs. Walker sat down heavily in the chair across from him, rubbing her temples. "There's pressure coming from the district. Elijah's behavioral issues are being labeled as a disruption to the learning environment. They're saying it's too much of a liability." Bradley clenched his jaw. "You're telling me they're going to throw him out because of a few mistakes? Because of things that are outside his control? This is ridiculous." "I'm telling you," Mrs. Walker said, her voice softer now but filled with urgency, "they're looking for a way to cut ties with him. And with you, too, Bradley." Bradley's heart dropped. "With me?" "Yes," she said, her eyes meeting his. "There's a lot of talk about you, too. About your involvement with Elijah. The administration feels like you're too emotionally invested in this case. They're questioning whether it's appropriate for a teacher to be so personally involved with a student's issues. They're even talking about investigating you for overstepping boundaries." The words hit Bradley like a punch to the gut. He had known the stakes were high, but hearing them spoken aloud felt like a blow to everything he had worked for. Elijah needed him. And now, in trying to save Elijah, Bradley was jeopardizing his own career. "I can't just stand by and let this happen," Bradley said, his voice rising with frustration. "He's a kid. He's already been through more than anyone should have to deal with, and now the school wants to give up on him." "I know," Mrs. Walker said, shaking her head. "But it's bigger than that. The district is under pressure from parents, from the media. They want a smooth, clean image. They don't want any scandals. They think expelling Elijah will solve the problem." Bradley sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the situation press on him like 1,000 pounds. He had always known that the system wasn't perfect, that it was far more interested in appearances than in doing what was right. But this? This was different. This wasn't just bureaucracy at work. This was about a kid's life, a kid he had promised to help. "I can't just let them do this," Bradley said, more to himself than to Mrs. Walker. "I won't let them." She looked at him with a deep, knowing expression. "Bradley, I understand. But the question is, how far are you willing to go? Are you prepared to risk everything for him?" The weight of her question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Bradley had been willing to fight for Elijah before, but now it felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice. The stakes had been raised. If he pushed back against the administration, if he fought too hard for Elijah's future, he might be risking his own career. His entire professional life could be at stake. But as he thought about Elijah's face, the vulnerability he had seen, the raw emotion, the glimpses of hope, Bradley knew what he had to do. Elijah needed him now more than ever, and Bradley wasn't going to turn his back on him. "I'm willing to risk it all," Bradley said firmly, his voice filled with determination. "I won't let them throw Elijah away. Not on my watch." Mrs. Walker looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "I thought you might say that. You're not alone in this, Bradley. I'll back you up. We can't let the system fail him." Bradley felt a sense of relief wash over him, though he knew the battle was far from over. If he was going to save Elijah, he had to go to war with the administration, with the district. But this time, he wasn't alone. He had allies, people who saw what he saw, who cared about the same things he did. And together, they would fight for Elijah's future. Later that afternoon, Bradley gathered his thoughts and made the call. It was time to take his fight to the next level. He reached out to Elijah's mother, Mrs. Green, to ask if they could meet and discuss what was happening. He needed her support, her voice would be crucial in this fight. When he walked into the small cafe where they had agreed to meet, he was greeted by Mrs. Green's weary smile. She had always been kind to him, but the weight of everything had worn her down. "Bradley," she said softly, "I don't know what to say. I feel like I'm losing Elijah every day. It's like I'm watching him slip away, and I don't know how to help him." Bradley sat down across from her, taking her hands in his. "We're not giving up, Mrs. Green. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure Elijah gets the help he needs. But we need to fight for him. The school is trying to expel him, and if that happens, he'll be lost to the system forever." Her eyes filled with tears. "I can't lose him, Bradley. He's all I have left." "You won't lose him," Bradley said firmly. "Not as long as I'm here." Bradley sat at his desk in the quiet of his office, his fingers drumming nervously against the surface. The weight of the battle ahead pressed on him like a heavy cloak. He'd made his decision. There was no turning back now. He had called a meeting with the administration for the next day, a meeting that would decide Elijah's future at the school. The stakes had never been higher. If he lost this, Elijah's expulsion would be inevitable, and Bradley's career would be forever tarnished. He had spent hours over the past few days, gathering information, preparing his arguments. He knew the administration would use every tactic in the book to dismiss Elijah as just another troubled student. They would say that his behavior was a disruption, that he wasn't a good fit for the school. But Bradley wasn't going to let them define Elijah like that. Elijah wasn't just a problem, he was a kid in need of support, in need of a chance to prove he could do better. As Bradley prepared to head home for the night, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Mrs. Green. "Bradley, I've been thinking. I want to be there tomorrow. I need to stand up for my son." Bradley smiled softly, feeling a surge of gratitude for her strength. She was scared, yes, but she wasn't backing down. Neither was he. "I'll see you tomorrow. We'll do this together." The next morning, Bradley arrived early, his stomach a knot of nerves. He stood outside the conference room, Mrs. Green by his side, ready to face the administration's representatives. The door swung open, and Bradley steeled himself as he walked inside. The room was cold, the long table a symbol of the power they held. On one side sat the principal, Vice Principal Thompson, and two other administrators. On the other side sat Bradley and Mrs. Green, both standing firm despite the tension that crackled in the air. The principal, Mr. Carlson, cleared his throat and glanced at the papers in front of him. "Mr. Harris, Mrs. Green, thank you for joining us today. We're here to discuss Elijah Green's recent behavioral issues and to determine the best course of action moving forward." Bradley felt a cold shiver run down his spine, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was the moment. "We're aware of the situation," Bradley said, his voice steady, "but I believe there's more to Elijah's actions than what's on paper. I believe he is a victim of circumstances that have pushed him to his breaking point." Mr. Carlson raised an eyebrow. "With all due respect, Mr. Harris, this is not about circumstances. Elijah has become a disruption in the classroom, and we can't continue to allow that behavior to go unchecked." Bradley's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. It's easy to label a kid as a disruption when you don't take the time to understand why they're acting out. Elijah isn't a troublemaker. He's a kid who has been neglected, bullied, and hurt for far too long. And he's been left to fend for himself in a system that doesn't care about his struggles. There was a brief silence. Mrs. Green, who had been sitting quietly, spoke up. "I've tried, Mr. Carlson. I've tried to help my son. But every time he comes home upset, scared, I feel helpless. And the school, the one place he's supposed to feel safe, has been failing him." The room fell into an uncomfortable quiet, but Bradley wasn't done. "Elijah needs help, not punishment," Bradley said firmly. "What he needs is therapy, mentorship, and most importantly, he needs people who believe in him. Expelling him would be the easy way out, but it won't solve the real problem. Elijah will only continue to spiral downward if we don't offer him the support he needs. Vice Principal Thompson, who had been quiet up until that point, spoke up. But what about the other students? We can't let one student's issues affect the entire school. Bradley leaned forward, his gaze never leaving Thompson's. What about the other students who are witnessing Elijah's pain? What about the example we're setting by throwing him away instead of helping him? We're teaching them that if you have a problem, if you don't fit the mold, then you don't deserve a chance. That's not the kind of message I want to send. The administrators exchanged uneasy glances, and for a moment, it felt like the tide might be turning. I'm not saying this will be easy, Bradley continued, his voice calmer now, but I am asking for a chance. Give Elijah a chance to prove that he can overcome his struggles with the right guidance. I'll work with him every step of the way, and I'll make sure he gets the support he needs. Mrs. Green nodded in agreement, her voice trembling but determined. I want what's best for my son. And I'm asking for you to see him as more than just a statistic. He's a child. He's my child. And I believe he deserves a chance. The room fell silent again, and the administrators looked between each other. Finally, Mr. Carlson spoke. We understand your concerns, and will take everything into consideration. We'll give Elijah a probationary period, he'll have access to counseling, and we'll monitor his behavior closely. But he has to make significant progress, or we'll have no choice but to take further action. Bradley's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to smile. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a step in the right direction. Elijah would have another chance, a real chance. Thank you, Bradley said, his voice filled with gratitude. I won't let you down. As they left the conference room, Mrs. Green placed a hand on Bradley's arm, her eyes filled with emotion. Thank you, Bradley. I don't know what we would have done without you. Bradley smiled, the weight on his shoulders slightly lighter now. You don't have to thank me. We're in this together. And we'll keep fighting for Elijah. That afternoon, Bradley found Elijah sitting alone in the school courtyard. His usual stoic expression was replaced by a look of uncertainty, a vulnerability Bradley hadn't seen before. Hey, Bradley said gently, sitting beside him. I've got some good news. Elijah looked up, his expression guarded. What is it? They're giving you another chance, Bradley said, his voice steady but full of relief. They're not expelling you. You're going to have a probationary period. You'll get counseling, and I'll be here every step of the way. Elijah's eyes widened, and for a moment, Bradley thought he might break down. But Elijah just blinked and looked away. Are you sure? You're not just saying that to make me feel better. Bradley smiled softly. I wouldn't say it if I didn't believe it. You've got a chance now, Elijah. A real chance. But you have to take it. I'll be there to help you. Every step of the way. Elijah's lips parted as if he was about to say something, but he stopped himself. He didn't have the words yet. But Bradley could see it in his eyes, the flicker of hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of counseling sessions, difficult conversations, and moments of quiet introspection. Elijah had, for the first time in a long while, a real chance to turn things around. But with that chance came an overwhelming sense of pressure, a weight that he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. Every morning, he woke up dreading the day ahead, unsure of whether he would succeed or fail. He knew the stakes. He knew that one wrong move could mean being sent back to the cycle of failure he had known for so long. His probationary period hung over him like a dark cloud, reminding him that his future was fragile, that everything rested on the choices he made in the next few months. Bradley had become more than just a teacher to him, he was a lifeline. A constant presence in the chaos of Elijah's world. But Elijah didn't know how to thank him for it. He wasn't used to people caring. He wasn't used to someone seeing him for who he was, not just for his mistakes, not just for his problems, but for the kid he could be. One afternoon, as Elijah sat in the counselor's office, He listened to the soft hum of the air conditioning and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Mrs. Keller, the school counselor, sat across from him, her eyes kind but firm. "How are you feeling, Elijah?" she asked, her voice gentle. Elijah shrugged, looking down at his hands. He hated these sessions. Talking about his feelings made him feel exposed, like there was nothing left to hide. But he knew he had to do this. He didn't want to fail, not this time. "I don't know," he muttered. "It's like. I want to believe it'll be different, but I'm not sure I can do it." Mrs. Keller leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "You're not alone in this, Elijah. You have support. Bradley is here for you, and so are the rest of us. But you have to believe in yourself, too." Elijah's chest tightened. "I've never had anyone believe in me before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Keller nodded, her expression softening. "That's not your fault. But it's important to understand that you can't carry this weight by yourself. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to try." Elijah clenched his fists, the pressure of it all threatening to overwhelm him. He had been trying for so long, fighting against the world that seemed to want him to fail. But now, with this new chance, this chance he wasn't sure he deserved, he felt like he was walking on a tightrope. One misstep, and he could fall. The bell rang, signaling the end of the session, but Elijah didn't want to leave. He didn't want to face the outside world, where everything seemed so much harder. But as he stood to go, Mrs. Keller's voice stopped him. "Elijah," she said, her tone warm, "remember that progress isn't linear. Some days will be harder than others, but as long as you keep moving forward, you're making progress." The next day, Bradley noticed the shift in Elijah. It was subtle, just a slight change in his posture, the way he walked into class with a little more purpose, a little less defiance. But it was there. It was progress, however small. After class, Bradley caught up with Elijah in the hallway, walking beside him toward the cafeteria. The school day had barely begun to settle into its rhythm when Bradley decided to break the silence. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice casual but laced with concern. Elijah shot him a quick, guarded glance. I'm trying, Mr. Harris. Really. But it's hard. I don't know how you keep doing it, how you stay positive all the time." Bradley smiled softly, the weight of his own struggles not lost on him. "It's not easy," he said. "But I keep going because I believe in you. I know you can do this, Elijah." Elijah didn't respond right away. They reached the cafeteria doors, and for a moment, he hesitated before speaking. "Why do you care so much?" he asked quietly, almost as if he were afraid of the answer. "I mean, you've got your own life. Why risk everything for me?" Bradley stopped in his tracks, turning to face Elijah fully. For a moment, there was nothing but the noise of students in the hallway, the clatter of trays, the murmur of voices. But in that silence, Bradley's words came out slowly, with the weight of years of experience. "Because you matter," he said simply. "Because every kid, no matter where they come from or what they've been through, deserves a chance. And I'm not going to sit back and watch you throw yours away." Elijah blinked, his throat tightening. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. No one had ever cared like this before. No one had ever looked at him like he was worth fighting for. Bradley placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch firm but gentle. "I'm here for you, Elijah. Every step of the way. You don't have to do this alone." The following days brought more challenges. Elijah had his ups and downs, moments of progress followed by moments of frustration. But with every small victory, he felt the weight of his past slowly start to lift. It wasn't gone completely, he still had his demons, his fears, but it was easier to breathe. Bradley kept a close eye on him, offering support and encouragement whenever needed. But more importantly, he showed Elijah that he believed in him, not because Elijah was perfect, but because he saw the potential that Elijah didn't yet see in himself. One afternoon, as Elijah sat in the library reading a book for English class, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible feeling, but it was there. For the first time, he didn't feel like a failure. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was alone in this fight. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. That evening, after the last bell had rung and the school began to empty, Bradley sat in his office, catching up on paperwork. His phone buzzed on his desk, and he glanced at it. It was a message from Mrs. Green. Elijah came home today smiling. He said school wasn't as bad as he thought. Thank you for everything. I don't know what to say, except that I'm grateful. Bradley smiled, a wave of satisfaction washing over him. It wasn't a huge victory, but it was a start. And for Elijah, that was everything. He typed a quick response. Tell him I'm proud of him. This is just the beginning. As the sun set over the school, casting long shadows across the campus, Bradley allowed himself a moment to reflect. The road ahead was still uncertain, full of challenges and setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Elijah had a chance now. And that was all he needed to keep fighting. Elijah woke up early the next morning, a bit earlier than usual, though it wasn't by choice. His thoughts had kept him up late into the night, questions swirling, doubts creeping into his mind. Could he really do this? Could he really turn his life around, despite everything he had been through? The day ahead felt heavier than most. The calendar on his phone flashed the word check-in, a reminder of his upcoming session with the school counselor, Mrs. Keller. For weeks, his sessions had felt like a lifeline. But today, for some reason, he wasn't so sure. What would she say this time? He hadn't been perfect. He had made mistakes. In the classroom, during lunch, even on the walk to school, there were moments when he slipped back into old habits, moments where the old Elijah threatened to surface, the Elijah that had been used to fighting for survival rather than fighting for a future. But today, there was something else in the air. A challenge. A test of everything he had worked for so far. And as much as he wanted to crawl back into the comfort of his old routines, he couldn't. Not anymore. When he arrived at school, he could feel the tension building. It was in the air, thick and palpable. Students were murmuring in the hallways, teachers giving quiet lectures about expectations for the day. But it wasn't just the usual school noise that bothered Elijah, it was the way people looked at him now. There was something different. Something heavier. Hey, Elijah, a voice called out from behind him. Elijah turned to see Trey, a classmate who had started hanging out with him more recently. Trey was one of the few kids who hadn't treated him like an outcast in the past few weeks. In fact, he seemed to want to be friends. Hey, Trey, Elijah replied, forcing a smile. Trey caught up to him, walking beside him as they headed toward the cafeteria. You good? You look like you've got a lot on your mind. Elijah shrugged. Just thinking about stuff, you know. Trey gave him a skeptical look. You're always thinking, man. What's up with you today? Elijah hesitated, unsure how to explain the storm in his mind. I guess I'm just worried. I'm not sure I can keep this up. Trey looked at him like he was crazy. What do you mean? You're doing great. Bradley says you've been getting better, right? I guess, Elijah mumbled. But, it feels like I'm always one step away from messing everything up. Trey stopped walking for a moment, turning to face him. You're not gonna mess it up, Elijah. You've got people who care now. You don't have to do this alone. Elijah looked down, the words sinking in. He didn't feel like he had anyone, not really. But Trey's words lingered, and for the first time in days, Elijah felt a small spark of hope. Maybe Trey was right. Maybe he wasn't alone in this. The day trudged on, and as the afternoon rolled around, Elijah found himself walking toward Mrs. Keller's office. He had been to her office more times than he cared to count, but today felt different. He could feel the weight of his decisions pressing in on him. As he sat down in her office, Mrs. Keller gave him a warm smile, motioning for him to take a seat. "How are you doing today, Elijah?" He hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to answer truthfully, or just say what she wanted to hear. But she was looking at him with genuine concern, and something inside him pushed him to be honest. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I've been doing okay, but it feels like I'm walking on a tightrope. One wrong step, and I'll fall." Mrs. Keller nodded, understanding more than he realized. "I think that's a pretty fair way to describe it," she said. "But you have to remember, being on a tightrope doesn't mean you can't find your balance. It just means you have to keep trying, no matter how hard it feels." Elijah looked down at his hands, struggling to find the words. "But what if I mess up? What if I don't make it?" "You're going to mess up," she said gently. "We all do. The real question is, what are you going to do when that happens?" Elijah swallowed hard. The idea of messing up again, of returning to the world where no one believed in him, scared him more than anything else. He had lived in that place for so long, and the idea of returning was suffocating. "I don't know," he said quietly. "You don't have to know right now," she replied. "But what matters is that you keep going. Keep showing up, even when it's hard. That's what will make the difference." That afternoon, Bradley walked into his classroom, the usual smile on his face as he greeted his students. But Elijah could tell something was different. The air was tense, and Bradley's usual relaxed demeanor seemed slightly off. After the bell rang, and the students began settling in, Bradley walked to the front of the room, holding a clipboard. He glanced around the room before addressing the class. "I need everyone's attention for a minute," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We're going to be doing something a little different today. I want each of you to write a short reflection on a challenge you've faced recently, and how you're working to overcome it." Elijah's heart sank. He knew exactly what Bradley was doing. This wasn't just an exercise for everyone, it was for him. It was a test. A way to gauge where he really was. As the class went on, Elijah sat in silence, staring at the blank sheet of paper in front of him. He could feel all the eyes of the class on him, even though no one said a word. The weight of his history, of the things he had done and the things that had been done to him, felt suffocating. He wasn't sure how to start. He wasn't sure how to say what he had been feeling without sounding like he was making excuses. Finally, after several minutes of silent struggle, Elijah began to write. "I've had a lot of challenges in my life. Some of them are things I did to myself, but most of them are things that happened to me. I've been through a lot, and sometimes I feel like I'm not even sure who I am anymore. People always tell me I'm not good enough, that I'm a problem. But I'm trying. I'm trying to be better. To not let the past define me, even though it's hard. I'm still learning how to trust people, how to let them help me. And that's the hardest part. For once in my life, I'm trying to let go of everything that's held me back, and I don't know if I can do it." He paused, his pen hovering over the paper. His chest felt tight, but there was something freeing about admitting his fears. He wasn't ready to let go of his past. But maybe, just maybe, he was ready to try. When the bell rang at the end of class, Bradley asked the students to hand in their reflections. Elijah hesitated, his hand gripping the paper tightly. But then, with a deep breath, he stood and walked to the front of the room. As he handed the paper to Bradley, their eyes met, and for the first time, Elijah saw something different in his teacher's eyes: respect, understanding, maybe even pride. "Good work, Elijah," Bradley said quietly. "You're making progress." And for the first time, Elijah believed it. The final bell of the school year rang through the hallways, signaling the end of another long, difficult chapter. But for Elijah, this wasn't just any ordinary end, it felt like the beginning of something new, something that held the promise of change. And though he didn't have all the answers yet, he knew one thing: he had come a long way. For months, Elijah had been walking a tightrope, balancing his past with the hope for a better future, trying not to fall off the edge. He had struggled, stumbled, but somehow, he had kept going. He had made progress, and the weight of the past didn't feel as heavy anymore. It was still there, but it wasn't defining him. He was defining himself now. The hallways were filled with the excited chatter of students rushing out to summer break, but Elijah didn't feel that usual rush to escape. Instead, he found himself walking through the corridors slowly, lost in thought, when he spotted Bradley's office door open. The familiar sound of footsteps behind him caught his attention. Elijah. He turned to see Bradley walking toward him, his usual easy smile on his face, but with something else in his eyes today, something warm and proud. "You busy?" Bradley asked. Elijah shrugged, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "Not really. Just thinking." Bradley stepped closer, his hands resting on the desk behind him. "Well, I have a minute. I was hoping we could talk." Elijah nodded, following him into the office. As they both sat down, the room was filled with a strange quietness, a kind of peace that hadn't been there before. It wasn't awkward. In fact, it felt like everything was falling into place. "I know it's been a long year," Bradley began, his voice steady. "And I know there were times when you didn't think you could keep going. But look at you now, Elijah. You made it. You kept pushing forward." Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yeah, but I'm not there yet, Mr. Harris. There's still so much I don't know how to fix." Bradley leaned back, nodding thoughtfully. "I get that. You've been through a lot. You can't just erase the past. But here's the thing, you've done something that most people can't do. You've kept trying. Every day, you made a choice. You chose to do the hard thing." Elijah looked up at him, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. "I don't know if I would have made it without you," he admitted quietly. Bradley's expression softened. "That's what we're here for, Elijah. To help each other. But the most important thing is that you did this. Not me. Not anyone else. You." Elijah blinked, the gravity of Bradley's words sinking in. He had spent so much time thinking about his past, his mistakes, his shortcomings, but here, in this room, he finally realized something. He wasn't just defined by the things he had done or the things that had happened to him. He was his own person. And he was ready to own that. "I'm still scared, you know," Elijah said after a long silence. "I'm scared of what happens next. I'm scared of messing up." Bradley nodded, his eyes understanding. "That's normal. Fear is a part of growth. But here's the truth, you're not alone in this anymore. And you have everything it takes to keep moving forward. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to keep going." Elijah felt the weight in his chest begin to lift, and he realized that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just going through the motions. He was actually living. "Thanks, Mr. Harris," he said quietly. "For believing in me." Bradley smiled, standing up and offering him a hand. "Anytime, Elijah. I'm proud of you." Later that day, Elijah found himself walking outside to the school's courtyard. The sun was warm against his skin, the breeze carrying with it the promise of summer. He could hear the laughter of his classmates in the distance, but for the first time, he wasn't part of the crowd. He was something else now, someone who didn't need to hide in the shadows anymore. He stopped at the edge of the courtyard, looking out at the field. His thoughts wandered, and as he stood there, something deep inside him shifted. He remembered the boy who had been angry and lost, the boy who didn't trust anyone, the boy who had never once believed he could be something more. But that wasn't who he was anymore. For the first time, Elijah could see his future clearly, not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of possibility. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew there would be days when he faltered. But he also knew he could face those days, just like he had faced everything else. One step at a time. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Trey. "Yo, summer's here. You down to hang out?" Elijah smiled, his heart lifting. For the first time, he felt like he had a place in this world. He wasn't alone anymore. "Yeah, I'm in," he typed back. He hit send and shoved the phone into his pocket, his mind buzzing with excitement for the first time in a long while. He didn't have everything figured out, but he didn't need to. The future wasn't something to be feared, it was something to be embraced. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his journey behind him, and the promise of his future ahead. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. As the school year came to a close, Elijah looked back on everything he had learned. It wasn't just the lessons from his classes that had shaped him, it was the lessons he had learned about himself, about strength, and about redemption. With the help of Bradley, Mrs. Keller, and his friends, Elijah had made it through. And while he knew the road ahead would still have its obstacles, he no longer faced it alone. He was ready to step forward, to build the future he deserved, and to continue proving to himself that no matter where he came from, he could choose who he would become. This concludes the story of Elijah's journey from struggle to strength, with the support of those around him, showing that even the hardest paths can lead to the brightest futures. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?